Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. Mark Davis trudged along the sidewalk, rain pouring down in sheets as he pulled his jacket tighter around his body. The gray sky seemed to echo the heaviness in his heart as he made his way to the cafe. At 23, he was carrying the weight of his final year of law school, a part-time job that barely paid the bills, and an avalanche of debts left behind by his late father. It felt like the world was closing in around him, and there was nowhere to turn. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He quickly pulled it out and read the message. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you regarding your financial situation. Please come to Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important." He frowned, wondering how this woman knew about his financial troubles. He didn't know anyone by the name of Eleanor Brooks, but something about the message made him feel a sense of urgency. As he reached the cafe, he hesitated for a moment before pushing open the door and stepping inside. The warm air inside the bistro was a sharp contrast to the cold, damp streets outside. Mark shook the rain from his jacket and scanned the room. At the back of the cafe, a woman sat at a corner table, her silver hair impeccably styled and her tailored suit radiating wealth. She looked to be in her 60s, with a commanding presence that immediately drew his attention. "Mark," she said calmly, her voice smooth and confident. "Please, take a seat." Mark took a deep breath and walked toward the table. He sat down, feeling a bit out of place in his wet clothes and worn shoes compared to her pristine appearance. Eleanor's eyes, sharp and calculating, met his as she set down her teacup. "I know about your debts," she began, not wasting any time. "The ones your father left behind. I know you're struggling to keep up with them, and I'm here to offer you a solution." Mark's brows furrowed. "How do you know about all of that?" "I know enough," she said, her voice steady and unapologetic. "You don't have the money to pay them off, and you've been working yourself to the bone just to get by. I can help you with that, but there's a catch." He leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What's the catch?" "I need you to marry me," she said flatly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "This is not a love match, Mark. It's a business arrangement." Mark stared at her, incredulous. "Marry you? Are you serious?" Eleanor nodded calmly. "I don't need love, Mark. I need a companion. Someone to help secure my legacy. Someone to share my name and my estate. You'll have no obligations to me beyond the contract. In return, I'll pay off your debts, take care of your financial security, and give you the freedom you've been seeking." Mark could hardly believe what he was hearing. He thought about the weight of his debts, the pressure of trying to keep his head above water. But marriage? To a woman he didn't even know? It sounded insane. And yet, a small part of him wondered if this was the only way out. He sat back in his chair, considering her proposal. The minutes stretched on in silence. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons of the cafe on him, but in that moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Why me?" Eleanor's lips curled into a slight smile. "You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider it. I don't need love, Mark. I need stability. You need money. We both get what we need." He hesitated, his mind racing. Was this his only option? Marry a stranger for the sake of his future? The thought made him feel sick, but at the same time, it was an offer he couldn't ignore. "I'll think about it," Mark said, his voice thick with doubt. He stood up, still unsure of what to do next. As he left the cafe, Eleanor's eyes followed him, unwavering, as if she knew exactly what he would decide. And in his gut, Mark knew she was right. This wasn't just an offer. It was a lifeline. And he was about to make a decision that would change his life forever. But could he really go through with it? Could he marry someone he barely knew, just for a business deal? As Mark stepped back into the rain, his heart heavy with uncertainty, he couldn't help but wonder what his future would look like after this meeting. And would this contract marriage end up being the worst mistake he ever made or the best thing that ever happened to him? Mark walked out of the bistro, still processing the bizarre offer Eleanor had made. The sound of his shoes splashing in the puddles echoed through the empty streets as he tried to shake off the heaviness of the conversation. His mind was racing. Was this really happening? Was he really considering marrying a stranger for the sake of his future? His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a reminder about the deadline for his student loans. The pressure was real, and his options were running out. He stood under the dim streetlight for a few moments, staring at the message on his phone. He needed a way out, but this was not how he imagined his life going. A marriage for money? Was he really going to trade his freedom for financial security? He shoved the phone back into his pocket, took a deep breath, and walked down the street toward his small apartment. Later that evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table, his mother sitting across from him, her worried eyes fixed on his face. The room was small and cluttered, the remnants of their financial struggles evident in every corner. His mother had always been strong for him, but tonight, she looked as fragile as the bills piled up on the table. "Mom, I met someone today," Mark began, his voice unsure. "A woman who says she can help me with everything. But there's a catch. She wants me to marry her. It's a business deal." His mother raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "A business deal," she repeated softly. "Mark, you don't even know this woman. How can you trust her?" Mark ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of his desperation. "I don't have a choice. I'm drowning in debt, and she can take it all away. But she's not asking for love, just a partnership. She needs me to help secure her legacy." He paused, looking at the table as though the answer was somewhere in the pile of overdue bills. His mother's face softened. She knew how hard Mark had been working to keep their lives together after his father's passing. She knew how much pressure he was under. "I just want you to be careful," she said quietly. "It doesn't feel right, but you have to do what you think is best for you. Just don't lose yourself in this, okay?" Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure what losing himself meant anymore. What did it matter? He was already losing everything else. The following morning, Mark made his way back to the bistro, his mind made up. He was going to meet Eleanor again, whether he was ready or not. He had to. He couldn't keep going like this. As he walked into the cafe, Eleanor was already sitting at their usual table, the same calm demeanor she had the day before. She didn't seem surprised to see him, her eyes flicking up to meet his as he approached. "You've made a decision," she said, not a question, but a statement. Mark took a deep breath and sat down. "Yes," he replied, trying to steady his nerves. "I'll do it. I'll marry you." Eleanor nodded, her face giving away no emotion, but Mark could sense a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good," she said, the word short but powerful. "I'll have the contract ready by tomorrow. But remember, this is a business arrangement, Mark. Nothing more." Her gaze softened slightly, but only for a second. Mark nodded again, though part of him still wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But the thought of his debts, his future, and his mother's disappointment pushed him forward. He spent the rest of the day in a haze, his mind on the deal he had just agreed to. He kept thinking about Eleanor's offer, about the life he would be trading for financial security. He knew he would never be truly happy with this arrangement, but maybe he could find a way to make it work. That evening, Eleanor's assistant sent over the contract, and Mark signed it without much thought. The next morning, they were married in a small, private ceremony, no guests, just the two of them, a notary, and a lawyer. As he walked out of the courthouse with Eleanor, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something important was missing. He had just signed away his freedom, his future, his happiness for money. And the weight of that decision felt heavier than anything he had ever carried before. But despite the coldness of the arrangement, part of him couldn't deny the allure of Eleanor. There was something about her, something more than just business, that kept him thinking about her even after their brief, transactional ceremony. Later that night, Mark found himself alone in a grand penthouse apartment, staring out at the city skyline. The view was breathtaking, but it only reminded him of how far away he felt from everything that had once mattered. He had given up his dreams, his independence, for security. Was it worth it? As the days passed, Mark began to see more of Eleanor. Their marriage was, at first, a business arrangement, with clear boundaries set by both of them. But as they spent time together, something began to shift. Eleanor was not the cold, calculating woman he had imagined. There was a kindness to her that Mark hadn't expected. And despite himself, he found himself wondering if this arrangement could turn into something more. But he was still unsure. Could he truly let go of everything he once believed in? Or had he already made the biggest mistake of his life? Days turned into weeks, and Mark found himself becoming more accustomed to his new life. The penthouse was everything he had never imagined: luxurious, spacious, with breathtaking views of the city. Yet, despite the opulence surrounding him, there was a gnawing emptiness inside. The deal he had entered into with Eleanor felt more real than the life he had left behind, but it still didn't feel right. He was a husband in name only, and he felt as though he was just a guest in his own life. He saw Eleanor almost every day, and they continued their routine. They went to events, meetings, and dinners together, but the connection between them remained strictly professional. The boundaries were clear. Eleanor was the powerful, composed woman who was always in control, and Mark was the man who had agreed to this arrangement to solve his financial problems. But there were moments, fleeting moments, when Eleanor's guard seemed to slip, when he saw a different side of her. It was in the way she smiled softly at him after a particularly difficult day, or how she would ask how his day went, even though she was always busy herself. Mark couldn't help but notice how she made an effort to include him in conversations and how her sharp eyes would linger on him for just a moment longer than necessary. He couldn't deny that he was beginning to look forward to these small interactions, even though he knew this was just part of their deal. But the more he saw her, the more he found himself wondering if there was something more between them. Could it be possible that Eleanor, someone who had seemed so distant and cold, could feel something real for him, too? One night, after a long charity gala, Mark and Eleanor found themselves alone in the quiet of the penthouse. He had just finished changing into his clothes when Eleanor walked in, her heels clicking softly against the polished floors. She was still wearing the evening gown she had worn to the gala, her hair beautifully styled. Despite the elegance, there was something in her expression that caught Mark's attention. She looked tired, drained, almost vulnerable. "You did well tonight," Eleanor said, her voice soft but sincere. "You handled everything perfectly." Mark looked up from where he was adjusting his cufflinks, surprised by her genuine praise. "Thank you," he replied, his voice unsure. "But I don't know if I'm doing a good job at this whole marriage thing." He chuckled lightly, trying to make light of the situation, but Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer to him. "Why do you say that?" she asked, her tone softer now, as though she genuinely wanted to know. Mark hesitated. He had always been careful not to blur the lines between their arrangement, but now, in this quiet moment, it felt impossible to ignore the growing feelings inside him. I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice quieter. "I don't know how to pretend this is just a business deal when it feels like something more." He looked up at her, his heart racing. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but it was out there now. Eleanor didn't move for a moment. She stood still, looking at him with an unreadable expression. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "Mark, this was never supposed to be about feelings," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "I made this arrangement with you because it was practical, not emotional. I needed someone to share my life with, someone I could trust to be there, but not someone to love." She paused, her gaze flickering for a brief moment, and Mark noticed the shift in her demeanor. Mark swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in his chest. "I get that," he said quickly, trying to push back the rising tide of emotions. "I do. But I can't help how I feel. And lately, I feel like you're not as distant as you were when we first met. I see the way you look at me sometimes. And he stopped, suddenly unsure of what to say next. Eleanor's expression softened, and she took a step closer to him. She placed a hand on his arm, the touch gentle, almost tentative. "I never meant to make you think this would be easy," she said quietly. "I never meant to make you feel anything. But I'm not as heartless as I seem. I know this deal wasn't fair to you. It was a way for both of us to get what we needed. But things are complicated now. I can see that. And I don't want you to feel trapped." She pulled her hand away, as though she was afraid of crossing a line. Mark felt a rush of relief mixed with confusion. She didn't push him away, but her words were filled with uncertainty, and it made him question everything about their arrangement. Had he misread the signals? Was Eleanor beginning to care for him, or was this just a temporary shift in her carefully controlled world? For the first time in a long while, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a chance for them after all. But the question still lingered: could a contract marriage ever turn into real love? As the night went on, Mark lay awake in his bed, staring out at the city lights. He had entered this arrangement with nothing but the desire to fix his broken life. But now, with Eleanor's touch lingering in his mind, he couldn't help but wonder if what they had could turn into something more than just a deal. But as he drifted off to sleep, one thing was clear: everything was about to change. The lines between business and emotion were starting to blur, and Mark was no longer sure where one ended and the other began. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension that neither Mark nor Eleanor seemed willing to acknowledge. Their arrangement, which had always been clear-cut just a business deal, was now blurred by their growing connection. Mark had tried to keep his distance, to remind himself that this wasn't supposed to be about emotions. But every time he saw Eleanor, the line between duty and desire became harder to define. It was during a quiet evening, after a long day of meetings and charity events, that things finally shifted. Eleanor had insisted they stay for a private dinner at the penthouse, just the two of them. She wanted to talk, she said, to discuss their next steps, business, of course. But Mark wasn't fooled. There was something in her eyes, something that made him think that this wasn't just about business anymore. As they sat across from each other at the large dining table, the soft glow of candlelight casting shadows on their faces, Mark could feel the weight of her gaze, the way it lingered on him as if she were searching for something. "Mark," Eleanor began, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "I've been thinking a lot about everything." She paused, her fingers tapping gently against her glass. "I know we agreed this would be just a contract, but I think we both know it's not that simple anymore. I've felt it, too." Mark felt his heart skip a beat. He had been wondering for days if she was starting to feel the same way he did. The way he caught her looking at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, the subtle way she touched his arm during meetings, those small, fleeting moments were enough to make him hope for more. "I know we're supposed to be partners," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "But I think I owe it to both of us to be honest about what I'm feeling. This marriage, it was supposed to be a way to solve problems, to keep things professional. But I'm starting to think it's something more. And I'm scared." She looked away for a moment, her expression softening. Mark sat back in his chair, the words hanging in the air between them. He had always admired Eleanor's strength and composure, but now, seeing her so open, so vulnerable, made him realize just how much he was drawn to her. She wasn't the cold, calculating woman he had thought she was. She was real, and despite everything, she was just as uncertain about their future as he was. For the first time since they had entered into this arrangement, Mark allowed himself to truly look at Eleanor not as the woman who had offered him a way out, not as his business wife, but as someone who had become an important part of his life. He leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I never thought this would happen. But you're right. I've been feeling it, too." I know this was supposed to be a contract, but somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like that. I don't want this to just be about money or obligations anymore. I want to know you. I want to be more than just this. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of their unspoken feelings. Eleanor's eyes searched his face, her lips parted as if she were about to say something, but she paused, unsure. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. I never meant for things to get this complicated, Mark. But I think I'm starting to realize that maybe I've been pushing away the one thing I've always wanted: someone to be with me for who I am, not for my money, not for my position. She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as if a great weight had been lifted. Maybe I've been so focused on my legacy that I forgot about what it means to truly live. Mark stood up slowly, moving around the table to where Eleanor sat. He didn't know what had come over him, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He reached out and gently took her hand in his, the warmth of her touch sending a shiver through him. You don't have to carry everything alone, he said, his voice slow and sincere. I'm here, Eleanor. Not because of the deal we made, but because I care about you. For a moment, Eleanor looked at him, her eyes searching his as if trying to decide if she could trust him with her heart. And then, just as Mark thought she might pull away, she squeezed his hand, a small but meaningful gesture. She wasn't ready to fully admit what she was feeling, but this was a start. As the night drew on, they sat together in silence, their hands intertwined, the distance between them shrinking with every passing second. The walls they had built around themselves began to crumble, and for the first time in a long time, both Mark and Eleanor realized that what they had wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was something real, something worth fighting for. And as the evening came to a close, they knew that no matter what happened next, they had taken the first step toward something new, something neither of them had expected. The lines between business and emotions had blurred, but in that moment, neither of them cared. They were ready to see where this unexpected journey would take them. The days that followed were filled with a newfound sense of closeness between Mark and Eleanor. What had begun as a business arrangement was slowly transforming into something more. They spent more time together outside of their formal duties, sharing quiet dinners, long walks through the city, and conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Mark found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: hope. Eleanor had become more than just his business partner. She was becoming someone he couldn't imagine his life without. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything changed. Mark was sitting in the penthouse, going over some paperwork, when he heard Eleanor's voice from the other room. Mark, can you come here for a minute? He stood up, setting down the papers, and walked into the living room where Eleanor was sitting by the large windows that overlooked the city. She was holding a letter in her hand, her eyes focused on the paper, but her expression was unreadable. What's wrong? Mark asked, his voice filled with concern. He could tell something was troubling her. Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting his. I just received some news, she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. It's about my family's estate. Mark's heart sank as he sat down beside her. What about it? She handed him the letter, and Mark quickly scanned the contents. The letter was from her family's lawyer, informing Eleanor that there had been a change in the will. It seemed her father, who had always been the head of the family, had made a decision that could drastically affect the future of her inheritance. What does this mean? Mark asked, feeling a knot form in his stomach. Eleanor's eyes were distant, her fingers nervously running over the edge of the letter. It means that if I don't comply with certain conditions, I could lose everything, she replied softly. The estate, the company, everything my family built, it's all at risk. Mark reached out and took her hand, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. What are these conditions? She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. The will states that I have to be married to someone who can secure the future of the family business. I've always done things on my own terms, Mark, but now it feels like I'm being forced into a corner. Mark's mind was racing. He could see how this situation was affecting her. Eleanor had always been strong, self-sufficient, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of money, it was about her legacy, her family's future. He looked at her, his mind made up. "You don't have to do this alone, Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "I'm here. I'll help you with whatever you need." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, she seemed to relax into his words. "But this is bigger than us, Mark," she said, her voice quiet. "This is about everything I've worked for, everything my family has built. I don't know if I'm strong enough to fight this battle on my own." Mark stood up, walking over to the window where Eleanor had been sitting. The view of the city, with its endless lights and skyscrapers, stretched out before them. He turned back to her, his face full of determination. "You don't have to fight this alone," he repeated, his voice firm. "We'll do this together. We'll find a way to protect what matters most. And no matter what happens with your family's business, Eleanor, I'm here with you. We're in this together." Eleanor stood up slowly, her eyes locking with his. The air between them seemed to shift, the walls they had both carefully built beginning to crumble. "You're really willing to do this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yes. We've already built something real, Eleanor. And whatever happens with the estate, I'm not going anywhere." For the first time since their arrangement began, Eleanor smiled a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was the kind of smile Mark had been waiting for, the kind that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something more than just a contract between them. In that moment, the future seemed uncertain, but Mark didn't care. With Eleanor by his side, he knew they could face anything. They had already come so far from the business deal they had started with. Now, they were building something real, something worth fighting for. As the night fell over the city, Mark and Eleanor stood together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they knew one thing for sure: they would face it together. The next few days were a blur of meetings and phone calls as Mark and Eleanor worked together to come up with a plan. They met with lawyers, financial advisors, and even some old family friends who could help navigate the legal side of things. Eleanor was no longer the cold, distant woman Mark had first met. The woman he saw now was focused, determined, but also vulnerable in ways he had never imagined. The walls she had built around herself were slowly crumbling, and Mark couldn't help but feel closer to her with every passing day. It was late one evening when they finally had a breakthrough. They had been sitting in Eleanor's office, the city lights shimmering outside the windows, when Eleanor finally leaned back in her chair, her expression softening for the first time all day. "I think we have a plan," she said quietly, looking over the papers spread out on her desk. Mark looked up from the documents in front of him, his exhaustion evident. "Are we sure this will work?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I believe it will," she said with more certainty than Mark felt. "But it's going to take everything we've got. We'll have to fight for this, Mark. For the estate, for the company, for everything I've built. But I can't do it alone." Her voice softened, and she added, "I need you." Mark nodded, his heart swelling at her words. She needed him. He had never imagined that he would be the one to help her, that he would be standing beside her through this storm. But here he was, and he knew, deep down, that he couldn't back out now. "You don't have to do this alone," he said firmly. "We're in this together. I'll help you however I can. Whatever it takes." He stood up, walking over to her and placing a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out. We'll protect your legacy." His words were simple, but they were the truth. Eleanor wasn't alone anymore. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. For the first time since they had started this journey, Mark saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a hope that wasn't just about the business or the estate. It was a hope for something more, something they could build together. Over the next few weeks, the pressure continued to mount. The legal battle was fierce, and Eleanor's family fought her every step of the way. But with Mark by her side, she found strength she didn't know she had. They worked tirelessly, negotiating with lawyers, holding meetings with potential investors, and doing everything they could to secure the future of the business and her family's estate. Through it all, their bond grew stronger. The lines between business and emotion continued to blur, and it became harder for Mark to deny that he had developed real feelings for Eleanor. He admired her determination, her intelligence, and the way she cared so deeply for the people around her even if she didn't always show it. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, they found themselves sitting on the balcony of the penthouse, the city lights stretching out before them. Eleanor was quiet, staring out at the skyline, her face etched with exhaustion. Mark could see how much this was taking out of her. "You've been amazing through all of this," he said softly, breaking the silence. "I don't think I could have done any of this without you." He looked at her, his voice filled with sincerity. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes tired but warm. "I don't know if I could have done it without you either," she admitted, her voice low. "I didn't expect to need anyone, Mark. But you've been there for me. More than anyone else." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the distance between them vanished. Mark reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "I'm here for you. Always." His thumb lightly traced the back of her hand, the simple gesture full of meaning. Eleanor's eyes flickered with something unreadable as she looked at him, and for a brief moment, he saw the woman he had come to care for so deeply. The evening stretched on, and they continued to talk, their conversation drifting between their future and the challenges they faced. It was no longer about business. It was about the life they were starting to build together, despite the obstacles in their way. As the night came to an end, Eleanor stood up, her exhaustion apparent, but there was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. She turned to Mark, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "We're getting closer," she said softly. "And we're going to make it through this. Together." Her voice was steady, but there was a softness to it that Mark hadn't heard before. It was as though, for the first time, she was allowing herself to believe that everything they had fought for might actually come true. Mark smiled, his heart swelling with pride and affection. "Together," he repeated. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what happened with the estate or the business, they had already built something far more important, something worth fighting for. The future was uncertain, but as long as they were in it together, Mark knew they could handle anything. The journey they had started as strangers, bound by a contract, had transformed into something far deeper, something that neither of them had expected but both of them now cherished. And as they looked out over the city that night, Mark couldn't help but feel that they were on the verge of something beautiful. Something that, no matter the challenges ahead, they could face as partners, as equals, and maybe, just maybe, as something more. The weeks went by in a blur, and despite the pressure mounting on both of them, Mark and Eleanor continued to grow closer. The legal battles over her family's estate were relentless, but they managed to hold their ground, pushing forward one step at a time. Mark had never imagined that he would be here, standing by Eleanor's side through it all. What had started as a business arrangement had slowly shifted into something far deeper. They were no longer just partners in a contract, they were partners in life. But as their relationship continued to evolve, so did the pressure. The stakes were higher than ever. Eleanor's family was pushing harder, and the legal battles grew more intense. Yet, despite it all, there was a sense of peace between them that Mark had never known before. Eleanor, usually so guarded, had let down her walls. She had opened up to him in ways he hadn't expected, and it made him realize just how much he had come to care for her. It was one evening, after another long day of meetings, that everything changed. Eleanor had come home from a particularly heated discussion with her family's lawyer. Mark was sitting in the living room, going through some papers when she walked in, her face pale and tight with stress. "Eleanor?" Mark called, looking up at her. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes seemed distant, and it made him uneasy. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're not backing down," she said, the weight of her words sinking into the room. "I don't know what to do anymore." She sat down beside him, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them in her lap. Mark reached out, placing a hand over hers. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions that raged within him. "I'm with you, Eleanor. We've come this far together, and we're not backing down now." His words were simple, but they carried more meaning than he could put into them. For a long moment, Eleanor didn't say anything. She just sat there, her head bowed, lost in thought. Mark watched her, his heart aching for her, for the burden she was carrying. It wasn't just the legal battles. It was everything: her family's expectations, the weight of her legacy, the pressure of trying to live up to it all. Finally, Eleanor lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. There was something different in them now, something that hadn't been there before. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm scared of losing everything I've worked for, and I'm scared of losing you. I never thought I would care about someone this much, especially not you." Her voice faltered, but she kept looking at him, as if searching for something in his face. Mark squeezed her hand, his chest tight with emotion. "You won't lose me, Eleanor. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I'm with you, no matter what." His words were a promise, one he intended to keep. He could see the doubt in her eyes, but he wanted to make it clear this wasn't just a contract for him anymore. This was real. Eleanor's eyes softened, the tension in her face melting away as she leaned into him. "I don't know what I would do without you," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "You've made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I don't have to do everything on my own." She closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Mark gently wiped away the tear with his thumb, his heart swelling with love for her. "You never had to do it all alone, Eleanor. You just didn't see it. But I see you. And I'm here." He leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead in a soft kiss. For a moment, they sat there together, the weight of the world outside forgotten. All that mattered was that they were there for each other, that they had each other. No matter what the future held, they knew they would face it together. As the evening wore on, the tension between them lifted, replaced with something more profound. They had made it through the hardest part of their journey, but there was still more to come. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt a sense of peace because she knew that, whatever happened, they would face it together. Mark knew that, too. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. He wasn't just fighting for her family's estate or business. He was fighting for her, for their future together. And that was worth every challenge they had to face. As the night fell and the city lights flickered outside the window, Mark and Eleanor sat together, hands clasped, hearts intertwined, ready to take on whatever the future held. The days that followed were nothing short of a whirlwind. Eleanor and Mark continued to face the mounting pressures of her family's expectations and the legal battles over the estate. But as they worked together, they found a new rhythm, one built on trust, shared purpose, and something deeper. What had started as a business arrangement had now become something far more significant. They had become partners in every sense of the word, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor began to believe in the possibility of a future where she wasn't alone. One evening, after yet another grueling meeting with her family's lawyer, Eleanor and Mark found themselves in the penthouse, the weight of the world hanging over them. They had just signed a new round of documents, trying to secure a settlement that would protect her legacy. But the strain of it all was beginning to take its toll. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," Eleanor said quietly, her voice barely audible as she sat on the sofa, her face tired from the endless battles. Mark sat beside her, his hand gently resting on her back. "You don't have to carry it all alone, Eleanor. We're in this together," he said, his voice calm but filled with determination. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes softening. For the first time, she let herself truly feel the weight of his words. She had been so focused on everything else, the business, the family, the legacy, that she had almost forgotten what it meant to lean on someone. But now, with Mark beside her, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She sighed, the exhaustion of the past few months catching up with her. "I never thought I'd end up here, Mark," she admitted. I thought I had everything under control. But it's all been so much. The pressure to live up to my father's expectations to protect everything he built. Mark reached out and gently took her hand. You don't have to do it all by yourself. You've already done more than most could ever dream of. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. I'm here, every step of the way. Eleanor's eyes filled with emotion as she looked at him. She had always been independent, always convinced that she had to carry the weight of her family's legacy on her own. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it alone. As they sat in silence, the city lights outside shining brightly in the distance, Eleanor finally let go of the tension that had been building in her for so long. She leaned her head against Mark's shoulder, closing her eyes as she allowed herself to feel the comfort of his presence. I'm glad you're here, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I would do without you. Mark smiled softly, his heart swelling with affection. You don't have to worry about that. I'm not going anywhere. He pulled her into a gentle embrace, holding her close, knowing that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. The following weeks brought more challenges, but also a sense of unity between them. The legal battles continued, but they were no longer just fighting for the estate, they were fighting for each other. And slowly, very slowly, Eleanor started to believe that there might be a way to balance her family's legacy with the life she had started to build with Mark. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the penthouse, Eleanor turned to Mark, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something more, something deeper. I've been thinking, she said softly, about everything we've been through. And about what comes next. You've shown me that there's more to life than just legacy and business. There's love, too, and I've realized that I want that. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had always known there was something special between them, but hearing her say it out loud made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. He took her hand in his, looking into her eyes with complete sincerity. I want that too, Eleanor. I've always wanted that. And I'll be right here with you, no matter what. The air between them shifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem as uncertain. They were no longer just navigating legal battles or living up to expectations, they were building something real, something that could last. And as they sat together, hand in hand, Eleanor realized that the greatest legacy she could leave wasn't just about the estate or the business, it was about the life she was creating with Mark, the life she had always wanted but never thought was possible. And in that moment, everything else faded away. All that mattered was the person sitting beside her, the man who had been with her through it all. Together, they had already overcome so much, and they were ready to face whatever the future held. As the night drew to a close, Mark and Eleanor sat together, knowing that their journey was just beginning. The past may have shaped them, but the future together was theirs to create. As time passed, the legal battles began to subside, and Mark and Eleanor's life slowly started to find a new balance. The estate had been secured, and Eleanor's family had finally agreed to the terms she had fought so hard for. But more than that, Eleanor had found something she hadn't expected: peace. Peace not just in her business, but in her heart. The pressure to live up to her father's legacy no longer felt like an unbearable weight. She had realized that, while the past was important, it was the future that truly mattered. One afternoon, a few months after everything had settled, Eleanor and Mark sat together in the living room of the penthouse, looking out over the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across the skyline. It was in this quiet moment, surrounded by the remnants of their journey, both the struggles and the triumphs, that Eleanor turned to Mark, her expression soft and filled with something deeper than words could convey. Mark, she began, her voice steady but full of emotion, I've spent so much of my life focused on securing everything for the future, making sure I didn't lose everything my family built. But I've realized that the only thing that truly matters now is the life we've started together. You've shown me that I don't have to carry all of this alone. She paused, her eyes meeting his with sincerity. I'm not just fighting for a legacy anymore. I'm fighting for us. For the life we're building together. And that is the greatest gift I could ever ask for. Mark's heart swelled with emotion as he listened to her words. He had always known there was something special between them, something that had grown beyond the business deal they had initially agreed to. But hearing Eleanor speak with such clarity about their future, about the life they were creating together, made everything feel real. It was no longer about the pressure of her family's expectations or the weight of the estate. It was about them, about the love they had found in each other. "I'm so proud of you," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've watched you fight for everything you believe in, and I've seen you open your heart in ways I never imagined possible. I know we've both been through so much, but I wouldn't change a thing, because it led me to this moment with you." He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I love you, Eleanor." The words came naturally, as if they had always been there, waiting to be said. Eleanor smiled, the smile that had become so familiar to Mark, a smile that was no longer guarded, no longer tinged with uncertainty. It was a smile that spoke of love, of a future that was finally within reach. She leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a soft kiss, a kiss that spoke volumes more than words could say. As they pulled apart, Eleanor's eyes sparkled with a quiet joy. "I love you too, Mark. And I'm ready for whatever comes next, for whatever we decide to build together. We've already overcome so much, and now, we get to create the future we've always dreamed of." She looked out the window, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Together." Mark looked at her, a sense of calm washing over him. The future was still uncertain in many ways, but with Eleanor by his side, he knew they could face anything. The challenges they had faced had only brought them closer, and the love they shared was something neither of them could deny. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark and Eleanor sat together, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined. The past had shaped them, but the future together was something they would create, day by day, with love, strength, and unwavering support. And so, as the city lights began to twinkle in the distance, they knew this was only the beginning. The life they had started together was theirs to shape, and no matter where it led them, they would walk that path side by side. The end of one chapter marked the beginning of another one, filled with possibility, love, and a future that was finally their own.